Hello, everyone. It is Will from the St. Johns County Public Library System, and we are here for a homeschool history. It's a little bit different than my quirky histories. Homeschool history topics are a little bit more traditional, if you want to call them that, a little more standard, but I hope to make them just as fun. There's always going to be a hands-on portion at the end, so just sit with with me through this for a couple minutes, and then we'll get to the hands-on portion here. So let's go ahead and get started. Let me bring up the screen here. And this month we're going to be talking about Southeastern Indians. And I just want to throw out a disclaimer here that there are people who end up going to college and just studying this topic. They're historians or archaeologists, and this is their whole life work. So we are not going to be able to talk about everything. That's okay. I'm just going to highlight a few key points or points that I think are really important, things that I've learned after looking at Southeastern Indians, and just hopefully so you kind of understand what the Southeast looked like when Europeans first arrived here. So this map right here is the area we're going to be talking about for the next few minutes. See all the little dotted lines here are pointing out modern state boundaries. Just so you kind of have an idea of what we're talking about, but these states didn't exist yet. So this is pre-United States. This is when the United States had figured out exactly what state boundaries and borders are going to look like. So the point of European contact means that the point where Europeans, whether they're Spanish or English, Dutch, whoever, French, came over and made contact with peoples living in what is now the United States for our purposes. Of course, they had contact in South America. They had contact with Canadian peoples, but we're just talking about the Southeast right now, the Southeastern United States. So as you can see from this map, even if you can't read all the names, that's okay. But all of these are different words, right? So these are different peoples. And this is not even all of them. This is just some of the bigger ones that we know about that were named by Europeans. The biggest thing to remember is that this area was very densely populated when Europeans first made contact here in the Southeastern United States. This land was not unoccupied for European settlement. So there's certain accounts from Europeans who talk about how this land is open and pristine and just barren, like barren as in there's no people. And they did this for a couple of reasons. They wanted to convince people back in Europe, especially people who are paying them, that these endeavors are worth it, that there's something to get here. This is a place that they can either get resources or expand their empires, right? But they also did it, Europeans also said it was open and free because the Europeans had a very different idea on what land ownership and usage looked like, especially the English. So if your neighbor has a fence, if you have a fence, fences are great, right? We all love fences. It marks off our boundaries from our little plot of land. That's a very English idea of land ownership. English were great at planting hedges or putting up fences to say, hey, this plot right here, this is my plot, it's no one else's. And they used the land. Europeans believed that you should use the land. So for things like farming or clearing it for a mill, stuff like that, any area that was left in its natural state was considered not being used, unless there were like a lord or a king who had like this area where they would hunt. But that was pretty rare in Europe. Most people didn't have their own private hunting grounds in Europe. So Southeastern Indians had a very different idea of what land usage was. It's not that they didn't shape their landscape. They did. We know they did. They would encourage fields to be grown, to like open pastures that are natural, to encourage deer to come because they hunted deer. They relied on deer, stuff like that. So it just looked a lot different. Southeastern Indians did farm. Farming looked a lot different, and we're going to get into some of that. I just wanted you to see this map to know that there's all these different peoples here. And these maps All I'm trying to show you is all these different colors here are different language groups. And this is all of North America. There's a lot of different languages. And unfortunately, some of these languages have died out, but some of the peoples who are descendants of the people at contact do still speak their languages. So let's talk very briefly about culture. We already kind of went over languages, and that's a good marker for culture. And again, the Southeast is densely populated, so there's several different cultures, even though they may have similarities. Southeastern Indians generally enjoyed a variety of game. So there's deer, raccoon, possum, fish, a variety of different animal proteins they could go after to supplement their diets, arable land, especially in the Georgia, Piedmont area, lots of rich soil for planting, and lots of edible plants in the Southeast. So Southeastern Indians had a diet that in many ways was healthier and better and more robust than the Europeans they were encountering. Initially, Southeastern Indians were much healthier than Europeans. And diseases are different thing, but for nutrition, they were much healthier. The Florida peoples, however, relied heavily on the marine environment. So there is a small area of land in the middle of the state that is good for farming, but there's a lot of areas in Florida that aren't. We have sandy soil or it's swampy. None of these are great for growing crops. So these two pictures are from the Calusa exhibit at the Florida Museum of Natural History. The left one shows the different shells and bones, things they used to make the tools they needed. And then over here on the right is a sculpture of an alligator head. I'm not sure what it's made out of. It's hard to see in the picture, and I can't remember from looking at it. But this head it's artwork. These people, the Calusa and other peoples, spent a lot of time collecting the nutrition they needed to survive. So anyone who sat here to make a sculpture, this held significance. No one's going to sit down, and there's not leisure time like we have today. So to sit down and make something like this denotes the fact that the alligator somehow held significance for the Calusa. So if you look at the things they make, any group of people, the things they make tells you what's important to them. Another big marker for Southeastern Indians is labor divisions, which are divided by gender. So women were responsible for farming, field maintenance, gathering the plants that were edible, cooking and preserving the food, and the care of young children and the elderly. Men handled most duties with war, hunting, and trade, though men would help with the harvest and help clear fields when needed. So this is where Europeans really got confused. In Europe, farming is a male occupation at this time. Field maintenance, field ownership, all this other stuff, all the things to do with farming is very much a man's job to Europeans. When Europeans saw women doing farm work, they were really confused, especially because if Indian men weren't actively engaged in war or hunting or trade, they did have a little bit more leisure time than some of the women because their duties were fulfilled. Doesn't mean they were lazy, but to Europeans, when they saw men not helping, that meant Indian men were lazy. That's not true, but that's how Europeans felt. So Europeans really didn't understand why Indian men were allowing Indian women to do a man's job because they didn't understand how the culture was set up. Another thing that threw off European men was the fact that these groups are matrilineal. So that means you track your identity through your mom. Indians didn't have last names like Europeans do, like we do. So, but I guess you could kind of understand it. Instead of taking maybe your dad's last name or male figure's last name, you would take a female's or your mom's last name. That's not perfect, but it's kind of the idea. Your whole identity was built off of your mom's lineage. So how they denoted that was through clans. So you belong to a clan. And whatever clan you belong to was the one that your mom belonged to. And your clan identity shaped everything. Who you could have like as a boyfriend or a girlfriend, and later a husband or a wife, who you could interact with. If your clan was at war with another clan, you weren't allowed to have contact with them unless it was a very specific type of negotiation or ritual, stuff like that. Your clans would denote who you played games with. So it denoted everything, and it passed through your mom. And European men had a very hard time understanding that. It just was so different. And to be honest, most Europeans didn't try very hard to understand either. Europeans found ways to communicate. They learned the language if they needed to, but they just didn't try very hard to really understand the group. And even if they did, they still didn't think it was right. So, like I said, women were the primary crop handlers. This is an illustration here of the Timucuan working their fields. You can see some men helping clear the field and plant. So this would have been a big town effort to get this field ready for whatever crop they're growing here. But the three most important crops that you'll find across most peoples in the Southeast are the three sisters: corn, squash, and beans. And there would have been several varieties of corn grown, and they're all planted in the same bed/field. So if you've ever grown beans, they need something to climb. Well, that's what the corn stalk did. You have your corn stalk, and the beans would grow up that, and then you would have the squash kind of make a ground cover. And the great thing about growing these crops together, they each take and put back different nutrients in the soil. So by growing them in the same field, you kept the field healthier longer, and you produced a pretty good yield. So yield is just how many ears of corn can you get versus how many plants of corn were planted. That's basically how it works. So they could get a lot. They could get enough for sustenance. They could get enough to store if they needed to, for bad crops or for the winter, stuff like that. This was another thing that Europeans had a very hard time with. Europeans plant things in very neat rows, separate crops, separate fields. We do this the same today as well. So let's say if you're driving through Hastings, where there's a bunch of farm fields, each field is going to be a different crop, and they're going to be in nice little straight rows. It's just a different way of planting and farming. But European men could not understand this style of farming the way that the Southeastern Indians employed it, and it just to them looked like a hot mess. Because again, they didn't understand enough to realize how well it worked. So we're going to make some salt dough pottery. This is not the same kind of pottery that you would find Southeastern Indian groups making, but we're going to do the best we can with what we have. This right here on the left is the basic recipe. If you don't currently have an adult with you, I would suggest you get one. Kneading the dough can be kind of tricky to get it just right, and you're probably going to want some help with the oven just to make sure that you don't burn yourself. So let's head to the kitchen and we can start making this dough. All right, everyone, we're here for the hands-on portion of our homeschool history, and we're going to make a very, very, very simple pottery piece. And the reason I'm choosing pottery is because Southeastern Indian cultures made a lot of pottery. You can actually track the cultures based off the pottery design. They all were a little different, and they all influence one another. So even though if you were to excavate like a shell midden or a housing, location where a camp was, you could find other pieces, probably some gold pieces, shell necklaces, stuff like that. That all came from outside of the Southeast. They were extensive trade networks between the different American Indian groups. All that stuff came from other cultures. What Southeastern Indian cultures traded, one of the things was pottery. So we're going to make a salt dough. If you have like Crayola modeling clay or other types of clay, you're more than welcome to use that. I don't have those things, so I'm going to make a salt dough. So you just need 3 ingredients. You need salt, all-purpose flour, and then lukewarm water, which I have cooling off back here. So we're going to start with, if you want to go ahead and heat up your water, it's a cup of water. So you can have that ready to go. And then we're going to have a cup of salt. This is going to make a lot, but you could probably cut this in half if you needed to. I'm afraid I'm going to mess up. So I'm just going to do the full recipe, which is 1 cup of salt, 2 cups of all-purpose flour, and then the 1 cup of lukewarm water. And okay, if you make a little bit of a mess, flour can be messy. I'm trying to pour this as cleanly as possible, which is semi successful. But I always make a mess when I'm doing this kind of stuff, so if you and your adult make a mess, that's okay. It's just flour. And I would recommend doing this with an adult or a friend who's a little bit older. It's always a little bit more fun to do these projects with someone else. Especially if you are going to bake this afterwards. You can bake it in the oven to harden it up quicker instead of waiting to let it dry. And if you're going to use an oven, you definitely want to use an adult to help you out a little bit, teach you. Some of you may already know how to use it, but it's always good to have an adult nearby just in case something weird happens. So we got our 2 cups of flour. All right, so then you're going to gradually pour in the water. You want to make sure it all gets mixed together really well. You don't want, clumps of flour in there. You want to make sure all the ingredients are incorporated. It's a big fancy word for mixed in really well. Still a little sticky. Just a little, you can see, just a little bit of flour in here to help with that. This is not a dough you're going to eat. I mean, I guess you could eat it. But it's not designed for that. It's designed to harden and bake. And alrighty. So once your dough is a good consistency, you're going to want to take it out of the bowl and put it on a clean surface. You're probably going to want to wash your hands because if you saw mine before, they had all the excess dough and flour and stuff on there. Wash your hands really well, dry them off really well, and then you have a mound of dough that is going to be our clay. Now, I'm not going to need all of this. You may or may not. If you are only going to play, like if you know for sure that you're not going to use all of it, then you're going to want to take the excess, seal it up real well, and it should last for a while. So you could do some other projects if you wanted to. So I'm going to attempt to make a bowl. You can make whatever it is you want with your clay or your dough. I'm just going to take off a little piece. I'm going to rub this out. Now, the thicker, if you do plan on baking it or even letting it dry, the thicker the dough ends up being, the longer it's going to take to dry or cook. Just so you know. If for some reason you wanted to color this, you could. You could wait for it to dry and color it afterwards. Or you can actually add food coloring to your dough. You could add coffee grounds or like curry powder to color it. You can even add paint. If you do decide to add paint, I would recommend using acrylic. But if you do that, you're going to want to use gloves when messing with this. I've seen some places where it says you can use tempera, and tempera is just not going to hold the color in the same way. And if you have an egg allergy, tempera has egg in it, or it can have egg in it. The traditional way to make tempera is to add egg as a binder. Okay, so if you want to bake yours, I just got a little cookie sheet out. And put some parchment paper down. Put the oven on 200, pretty low. Looks like low longer works better than really high heat faster. So I'm going to attempt to move these guys over. All right, so I'm gonna put him in the oven for about an hour and we will see how it turns out. All right, so my baking took a little bit longer than I expected it. I baked my guy for probably about 4 hours, and the last hour I bumped up the oven to 225, but here he is. He's my little pot. He's got a little lid, and it pretty much fits. I didn't paint mine, but feel free to paint yours. And if you're able to, share it with commenting below, and make sure you like this video. And I hope you guys tune in for the next homeschool history, which I believe is the Louisiana Purchase. Y'all have a great day.